John Gotti was born in the Bronx borough of New York City on October 27, 1940. He was the fifth of the 13 children. Two had died at birth of John Joseph Gotti Sr. and Philomena Fanny DiCarlo. His parents were born in New York City, but it is presumed that his grandparents were from San Giuseppe Vesuviano in the Italian province of Naples, because his parents were married and lived there for some time. Gotti was one of 5 brothers who became made men in the Gambino crime family. Eugene Gene Gotti was initiated before John due to the latter's incarceration. Peter Gotti was initiated under John's leadership in 1988, and Richard Gotti was identified as a capo regime, captain, or head of a crew by 2002. By the time he reached the age of 12, Gotti's family settled in East New York, Brooklyn, where he grew up in poverty alongside his brothers. His father worked irregularly as a day laborer. As an adult, he came to resent his father for being unable to provide for his family. In school, he had a history of truancy and bullying other students, and ultimately dropped out of Franklin K. Lane High School at the age of 16. John was involved in street gangs associated with New York City mafiosi from the age of 12. When he was aged 14, he was attempting to steal a cement mixer from a construction site when it fell, crushing his toes. This injury left him with a permanent limp. After leaving school, he devoted himself to working with the mafia-associated Fulton Rockaway Boys gang, where he met and befriended fellow future Gambino mobsters Angelo Ruggiero and Wilfred Willie Boy Johnson. Gotti met his future wife, Victoria DiGiorgio, who was of half Italian and half Russian descent, at a bar in 1958. The couple were married on March 6, 1962. According to FBI documents, DiGiorgio was married previously and had 1 child by the previous marriage. They had 5 children: Angela, Victoria, John Jr., Frank, and Peter. Gotti attempted to work legitimately in 1962 as a presser in a coat factory and as an assistant truck driver. However, he could not stay crime-free, and by 1966 had been jailed twice. As early as his teens, John Gotti was running errands for Carmine Fatico, a capo in the Gambino family, then known as the Anastasia family, under the leadership of boss Albert Anastasia. Gotti carried out truck hijackings at Idlewild Airport, now John F. Kennedy International Airport, together with his brother Gene and friend Ruggiero. During this time, Gotti befriended fellow mob hijacker and future Bonanno family boss Joseph Massino, and he was given the nicknames Black John and Crazy Horse. It was around this time that Gotti met his mentor, Gambino underboss Aniello Neil Della Croce. In February 1968, United Airlines employees identified Gotti as the man who had signed for stolen merchandise. The FBI arrested him for that hijacking soon after. Gotti was arrested a 3rd time for hijacking while out on bail 2 months later, this time for stealing a load of cigarettes worth $50,000 on the New Jersey Turnpike. Later that year, Gotti pleaded guilty to the hijacking of Northwest Airlines cargo trucks and was sentenced to 3 years at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. Gotti and Ruggiero were paroled in 1972 and returned to their old crew at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, still working under Fatico. Gotti took responsibility for managing the Bergen crew's illegal gambling operation, where he proved himself to be an effective enforcer. Fatico was indicted on loan sharking charges in 1972. As a condition of his release, he could not associate with known felons. Gotti was not yet a made man, due to the membership books having been closed following the 1957 Appalachian meeting, but Fatico named him acting capo of the Bergen crew soon after he was paroled. In this new role, Gotti frequently traveled to Della Croce's headquarters at the Ravenite Social Club to brief the underboss on the crew's activities. Della Croce had already taken a liking to Gotti, and the two became even closer during this time. The two were very similar. Both had strong violent streaks, cursed frequently, and were heavy gamblers. After Emmanuel Gambino, nephew to boss Carlo Gambino, was kidnapped and murdered in 1973, Gotti was assigned to the hit team alongside Ruggiero and fellow enforcer Ralph Gallione to search for the main suspect, gangster James McBratney. The three men botched their attempt to abduct McBratney at a Staten Island bar when they attempted to arrest him while posing as NYPD detectives, and Gallione shot McBratney dead when his accomplices managed to restrain him. Gotti was identified by eyewitnesses and by a police insider, and was arrested for the killing in June 1974. He was able to strike a plea bargain, however, with the help of attorney Roy Cohn, and was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment for attempted manslaughter for his part in the hit. Following Gotti's death, he was also identified by Massino as the killer of Vito Borelli, a Gambino associate murdered in 1975. Remo Franceschini, a member of the New York City Police Department from 1957 to 1991, who specialized in organized crime, when asked in 1993 why he knew at an early stage that Gotti would become a major figure in the mafia, said, "He was charismatic and a leader. He wasn't a womanizer. He spent all his time with his men. He also had a very sharp mind and total recall. And he exuded toughness. There were few men who would go against him." On October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino died at his home of natural causes. Against expectations, he had appointed Paul Castellano to succeed him over his underboss Della Croce. Gambino appeared to believe that his crime family would benefit from Castellano's focus on white-collar businesses. Della Croce, at the time, was imprisoned for tax evasion and was unable to contest Castellano's succession. Castellano's succession was confirmed at a meeting on November 24th, with Della Croce present. Castellano arranged for Della Croce to remain as underboss while directly running the family's affairs. While Della Croce accepted Castellano's succession, the deal effectively split the Gambino family into two rival factions. In 1976, the Gambino family's membership books were reportedly reopened. Gotti was released in July 1977 after 2 years' imprisonment. He was subsequently initiated into the crime family, now under the command of Castellano, and immediately promoted to replace Fatico as captain of the Bergen crew. Gotti's crew reported directly to Della Croce as part of the concessions given by Castellano to keep Della Croce as underboss, and Gotti was regarded as Della Croce's protégé. Under Gotti, the crew were Della Croce's biggest earners. Besides his cut of his subordinates' earnings, he ran his own loan sharking operation and held a no-show job as a plumbing supply salesman. Unconfirmed allegations by FBI informants claimed that Gotti also financed drug deals. In December 1978, Gotti assisted in the Lufthansa heist at Kennedy Airport, the largest unrecovered cash robbery in history. He had made arrangements for the getaway van to be crushed and bailed at a scrapyard in Brooklyn. However, the driver of the van, Parnell Stax Edwards, failed to follow orders. Rather than driving the vehicle to the scrapyard, he parked it near a fire hydrant and went to sleep at his girlfriend's apartment. Gotti mostly tried to distance his personal family from his life of crime, with the exception of his son John Jr., who was a mob associate by 1982. He was indicted on 2 occasions in his last 2 years as the Bergen captain, with both cases coming to trial after his ascension to boss of the Gambino family. In September 1984, he had an altercation with a refrigerator mechanic named Romuald Piesik and was subsequently charged with assault and robbery. In 1985, he was indicted alongside Della Croce and several Bergen crew members in a racketeering case by Diane Giacalone. The indictment revealed that Gotti's friend and co-defendant, Wilfred Willie Boyd Johnson, had been an FBI informant. Gotti quickly became dissatisfied with Castellano's leadership of the Gambino family, regarding the new boss as being too isolated and greedy. Like other members of the family, he also personally disliked Castellano. The boss lacked street credibility, and those who had paid their dues running street-level jobs did not respect him. Gotti had an economic interest as well. he had a running dispute with Castellano on the split he took from truck hijackings at Kennedy Airport. Gotti was also rumored to be expanding into drug dealing, a lucrative trade Castellano had banned. In August 1983, Ruggiero and Gene Gotti were arrested for dealing heroin, based primarily on recordings from a bug in Ruggiero's house. Castellano, who had banned made men from his family from dealing drugs under threat of death, demanded transcripts of the tapes, and when Ruggiero refused, he threatened to demote John. In 1984, Castellano was arrested and indicted in a RICO case for the crimes of Gambino hitman Roy DeMeo's crew. The following year, he received a second indictment for his role in the Commission, the mafia's governing body. Facing life imprisonment for either case, Castellano arranged for Gotti to serve as an acting boss alongside Thomas Bellotti, Castellano's favorite captain, and Thomas Gambino in his absence. Gotti, meanwhile, began conspiring with fellow disgruntled captains, collectively dubbed the Fist, to overthrow Castellano, insisting, despite the boss' inaction, that Castellano would eventually try to kill him. Armon's support was critical. As a respected old-timer who dated back to the family's founder, Vincent Mangano, he would lend needed credibility to the conspirators' cause. It had long been a rule in the mafia that a boss could only be killed with the approval of a majority of the commission. Indeed, Gotti's planned hit would have been the first unsanctioned hit on a boss of the five families since Frank Costello was nearly killed in 1957, and would have been the first on any boss since Angelo Bruno in 1980. Gotti knew that it would be too risky to solicit support from the other four bosses, since they had long-standing ties to Castellano. To get around this, he got the support of several important figures of his generation in the Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families. He did not consider approaching the Genovese family. Castellano's ties with Genovese boss Vincent, the Chin Gigante, were so close that any overture to a Genovese soldier would have been a tip-off. However, Gotti could also count on the complicity of Gambino consigliere Joseph N. Gallo. After Della Croce died of cancer on December 2, 1985, Castellano revised his succession plan, appointing Bellotti as underboss to Thomas Gambino as the sole acting boss, while making plans to break up Gotti's crew. Infuriated by this, and by Castellano's refusal to attend Della Croce's wake, Gotti resolved to kill his boss. When DeCicco tipped off Gotti that he would be having a meeting with Castellano and several other Gambino mobsters at Spark Steakhouse on December 16th, Gotti chose to take the opportunity. Both the boss and underboss were ambushed and shot dead by assassins under Gotti's command when they arrived at the meeting in the evening. Gotti watched the hit from his car alongside Gravano. Several days after the murder, John was named to a three-man committee to temporarily run the Gambino family pending the election of a new boss, along with Gallo and DeCicco. It was also announced that an internal investigation into Castellano's murder was underway. However, it was an open secret that Gotti was acting boss in all but name, and nearly all of the family's capos knew he had been the one behind the hit. He was formally acclaimed as the new boss of the family. He appointed DeCicco as the new underboss while retaining Gallo as consigliere. Identified as both Castellano's likely murderer and his successor, Gotti rose to fame throughout 1986. At the time of his takeover, the Gambino family was regarded as the most powerful American mafia family, with an annual income of $500 million. In the book Underboss, Gravano estimated that Gotti himself had an annual income of no less than $5 million during his years as boss, and more likely between $10 million and $12 million. To protect himself legally, Gotti banned members of the family from accepting plea bargains that acknowledged the existence of the organization. He often smiled and waved at television cameras at his trials, which gained him favor with some of the general public. His newfound notoriety had at least one positive effect. Upon the revelation of his attacker's occupation, and amid reports of intimidation by the Gambinos, Pisak decided not to testify against Gotti thanks to Boško the Jugo Radonjic, the head of the Westies in Hell's Kitchen. When the trial began in March 1986, Pisak testified he was unable to remember who attacked him. The case was promptly dismissed, with the New York Post summarizing the proceedings with the headline, "I for Gotti." It was later revealed that Gambino mobsters had severed Pisak's brake lines, made threatening phone calls, and stalked him before the trial. On April 13, 1986, Dicko was killed in a car bombing following a visit to Castellano loyalist Jimmy Fila. The bombing was carried out by Victor Amuso and Anthony Casso of the Lucchese family, under orders of Gigante and Lucchese boss Anthony Corallo, to avenge Castellano and Bellotti by killing their successors. Gotti also planned to visit Jimmy that day but canceled, and the bomb was detonated after a soldier who rode with DeCicco was mistaken for the boss. Bombs had long been banned by the mafia out of concern that it would put innocent people in harm's way, leading the Gambinos to initially suspect that Zips, Sicilian mafiosi working in the U.S., were behind it. Zips were well known for using bombs. Following the bombing, Judge Eugene Nickerson, presiding over Gotti's racketeering trial, rescheduled to avoid a jury tainted by the resulting publicity, while Giacalone had Gotti's bail revoked due to evidence of witness intimidation in the Pisak case. From jail, Gotti ordered the murder of Di Bernardo by Gravano. Both Di Bernardo and Ruggiero had been vying to succeed DeCicco until Ruggiero accused Di Bernardo of challenging Gotti's leadership. When Ruggiero, also under indictment, had his bail revoked for his abrasive behavior in preliminary hearings, a frustrated Gotti instead promoted Armone to underboss. Jury selection for the racketeering case began again in August 1986, with Gotti standing trial alongside his ex-companion Johnson, who, despite being exposed as an informant, refused to turn state's evidence, Leonard DeMaria, Tony Rampino, Nicholas Carozzo, and John Carneglia. At this point, the Gambino family were able to compromise the case when George Pape hid his friendship with Radonjic and was impaneled as juror number 11. Through Radonjic, Pape contacted Gravano and agreed to sell his vote on the jury for $60,000. In the trial's opening statements on September 25th, Gotti's defense attorney Bruce Cutler denied the existence of the Gambino family and framed the government's entire effort as a personal vendetta. His main defense strategy during the prosecution was to attack the credibility of Giacalone's witnesses by discussing their crimes committed before their turning state's evidence. During Gotti's defense, Cutler called bank robber Matthew Traynor, a would-be prosecution witness dropped for unreliability, who testified that Giacalone offered him drugs and her underwear as a masturbation aid in exchange for his testimony. Traynor's allegations would be dismissed by Judge Nickerson as wholly unbelievable after the trial, and he was subsequently convicted of perjury. Despite Cutler's defense and critiques about the prosecution's performance, according to mob writers Jerry Capisi and Gene Mustaine, when the jury's deliberations began, a majority were in favor of convicting Gotti. However, due to Pape's misconduct, Gotti knew from the beginning of the trial that he could do no worse than a hung jury. During deliberations, Pop held out for acquittal until the rest of the jury began to fear their own safety would be compromised. On March 13, 1987, they acquitted Gotti and his co-defendants of all charges, including loan sharking, illegal gambling, murder, and truck hijackings. 5 years later, Pape was convicted of obstruction of justice for his part in the fix and sentenced to 3 years in prison. In the face of previous mafia convictions, particularly the success of the Mafia Commission trial, Gotti's acquittal was a major upset that further added to his reputation. The American media dubbed him the Teflon Don in reference to the failure of any charges to stick. While Gotti himself had escaped conviction, his associates were not as fortunate. The other two men in the Gambino administration, underboss Armone and consigliere Gallo, had been indicted on racketeering charges in 1986 and were both convicted in December 1987. Ruggiero and Gene Gotti's heroin trial also commenced in June of that year. Prior to their convictions, Gotti demoted Gallo, who retired to allow Gravano to take his place, while slating Frank Locascio to serve as acting underboss in the event of Armoni's imprisonment. The Gambinos also worked to compromise the heroin trial's jury, resulting in 2 mistrials. When the terminally ill Ruggiero was severed and released in 1989, Gotti refused to contact him, blaming him for the Gambino family's misfortunes. According to Gravano, Gotti also considered murdering Ruggiero, and when he finally died, I literally had to drag him to the funeral. Beginning in January 1988, Gotti, against Gravano's advice, required his capos to meet with him at the Ravenite Social Club once a week. Regarded by Gene as an unnecessary vanity-inspired risk, and by FBI Gambino squad leader Bruce Mao as antithetical to the secret society, this move allowed FBI surveillance to record and identify much of the Gambino hierarchy. It also provided strong circumstantial evidence that Gotti was a boss. Long-standing protocol in the mafia requires public demonstrations of loyalty to the boss. The FBI also bugged the Ravenite, but failed to produce any high-quality incriminating recordings. Later in 1988, Gotti, Gigante, Musso attended the first commission meeting since the commission trial, located at the Labar Bat Club in Manhattan. 2 years earlier, Casso had been injured in an unauthorized hit by Gambino capo Mickey Paradiso. In 1987, the FBI warned Gotti they had recorded Genovese consigliere Louis Manna discussing another hit on Gotti and his brother. In order to avoid a war, the leaders of the 3 families met, denied knowledge of their violence against one another, and agreed to communicate better. The bosses also agreed to allow Colombo acting boss Victor Arena to join the commission, but Gigante, wary of giving Gotti a majority by admitting another ally, blocked the re-entry of Massino and the Bonanos. Gotti was also able to influence the New Jersey-based DeCavalcante crime family in 1988. According to the DeCavalcante captain-turned-informant Anthony Rotondo, Gotti attended his father's wake with numerous other Gambino mobsters in a show of force, and forced boss Giovanni Riggi to agree to run his family on the Gambino's behalf. The DeCavalcantes remained in the Gambino family's sphere of influence until Gotti's imprisonment. Gotti's son, John Jr., was initiated into the Gambino family on Christmas Eve 1988. According to fellow mobster Michael DiLeonardo, initiated on the same night, Gravano held the ceremony to keep Gotti from being accused of nepotism. John Jr. was promptly promoted to captain. In 1989, Gotti ordered the murder of real estate developer Fred Weiss because he was worried that Weiss might become a government witness in exchange for leniency, and requested that the DeCavalcante crime family murder Weiss, and Vincent Vinny Ocean Palermo and Jimmy Gallo shot Weiss in the face, killing him instantly. Anthony Capo was the getaway driver in the hit. Also in 1990, John D'Amato was appointed acting boss of the DeCavalcante crime family by Giovanni Riggi when Riggi went to prison. On the evening of January 23, 1989, Gotti was arrested outside the Ravenite and charged with ordering the 1986 assault of labor union official John O'Connor. In the back of the police car, he remarked, "3-1 I beat this charge." O'Connor, a leader in the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners of America, UBC, Local 608, who was later convicted of racketeering himself, was believed to have ordered an attack on a Gambino-associated restaurant that had snubbed the union and was subsequently shot and wounded by the Westies. After one night in jail, Gotti was released on a $100,000 bail. He had his occupation listed as a salesman for a plumbing contracting company. By this time, the FBI had cultivated new informants and learned part of the reason the Ravenite bug failed was because Gotti would hold sensitive conversations elsewhere, either in a rear hallway in the building the club occupied, or in an apartment in its upper floors where a friendly widow of a Gambino soldier lived. By November 1989, both locations were bugged. The apartment bug was particularly fruitful due to Gotti's frankness as he discussed his position as boss in meetings there. In a December 12th conversation with Locascio, Gotti plainly acknowledged ordering the murders of Di Bernardo and Liborio Milito, the latter being one of Gravano's partners killed for insubordination. He also announced his intent to kill soldier Louis de Bono, who had ignored a summons to meet with Gotti to discuss his mismanagement of a drywall business he held with Gotti and Gravano. The FBI, however, misheard the name drop and failed to warn de Bono, who was killed on October 4, 1990. In another taped meeting on January 4, 1990, Gotti promoted Sammy to underboss, preferring him to lead the family if he was convicted in the assault case. State prosecutors linked Gotti to the case, with a recording of him discussing O'Connor and announcing his intention to bust him up, and the testimony of Westie's gangster James McElroy. However, Gotti was acquitted of all 6 assault and conspiracy charges at trial on February 9, 1990. After the trial, there were firework displays by locals. Jules J. Bonavolanta, director of the FBI's Organized Crime Division in New York, stated, "With all this media coverage, he's beginning to look like a folk hero. What the public should realize is that he is the boss of the largest mafia family, that he surrounds himself with ruthless killers, and that he is flat out a criminal." It later emerged that FBI bugs had apparently caught Gotti discussing plans to fix the jury, as he had in the 1986 to 1987 racketeering case. To the outrage of Manhattan District Attorney Robert Morgenthau and State Organized Crime Task Force Chief Ronald Goldstock, the FBI and federal prosecutors chose not to reveal this information to them. Morgenthau later said that had he known about these bugged conversations, he would have asked for a mistrial. Gotti, Gravano, and Locascio were often recorded by the bugs placed throughout the Ravenite, concealed in the main room, the first-floor hallway, and the upstairs apartment, discussing incriminating events. On December 11, 1990, FBI agents and NYPD detectives raided the Ravenite, arresting Gotti, Gravano, and Locascio. Federal prosecutors charged Gotti, in this new racketeering case, with 5 murders: Castellano, Bellotti, Di Bernardo, Milito, and after review of the apartment tapes, Louis de Bono, conspiracy to murder Gaetano Corky Vastola, loan sharking, illegal gambling, obstruction of justice, bribery, and tax evasion. Based on tapes from FBI bugs played at pretrial hearings, the Gambino administration was denied bail. At the same time, attorneys Cutler and Gerald Shargel were disqualified from defending Gotti and Gravano after prosecutors successfully contended they were part of the evidence and thus liable to be called as witnesses. Prosecutors argued that Cutler and Shargel not only knew about potential criminal activity, but had worked as in-house counsel for the Gambino family. Gotti subsequently hired Albert Krieger, a Miami attorney who had worked with Joseph Bonanno, to replace Cutler. The tapes also created a rift between Gotti and Gravano, where the Gambino boss described his newly appointed underboss as too greedy and attempted to frame Sammy as the main force behind the murders of Di Bernardo, Milito, and Di Bono. Gotti's attempt at reconciliation failed, leaving Sammy disillusioned with the mob and doubtful on his chances of winning his case without Shargel, his former attorney. He ultimately opted to turn state's evidence, formally agreeing to testify on November 13, 1991. He was the highest-ranking member of a New York crime family to turn informer until Joseph Massino in 2003. Gotti and Locascio were tried in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of New York, before District Judge Elio Glasser. Jury selection began in January 1992 with an anonymous jury, and for the first time in a Brooklyn federal case, fully sequestered during the trial due to Gotti's reputation for jury tampering. The trial commenced with the prosecution's opening statements on February 12th. Prosecutors Andrew Maloney and John Gleason began their case by playing tapes showing Gotti discussing Gambino family business, including murders he approved, and confirming the animosity between Gotti and Castellano to establish the former's motive to kill his boss. After calling an eyewitness of the Castellano hit who identified Carneglia as one of the men who shot Bellotti, they then brought Gravano to testify on March 2nd. On the stand, Gravano confirmed Gotti's place in the structure of the Gambino family and described in detail the conspiracy to assassinate Castellano, giving a full description of the hit and its aftermath. Sammy confessed to 19 murders, implicating Gotti in 4 of them. Krieger and Locasio's attorney Anthony Cardinale proved unable to shake Sammy during cross-examination. After additional testimony and tapes, the government rested its case on March 24th. 5 of Krieger and Cardinale's intended 6 witnesses were ruled irrelevant or extraneous, leaving only Gotti's tax attorney, Murray Appelman, to testify on his behalf. The defense also attempted unsuccessfully to have a mistrial declared based on Maloney's closing remarks. Gotti himself became increasingly hostile during the trial, and at one point, Glasser threatened to remove him from the courtroom. Among other outbursts, Gotti called Gravano a junkie, while his attorneys sought to discuss his past steroid use, and equated the dismissal of a juror to the fixing of the 1919 World Series. On April 2, 1992, after only 14 hours of deliberation, the jury found Gotti guilty on all charges of the indictment. Locascio was found guilty on all but 1. James Fox, assistant director in charge of the FBI's New York field office, announced at a press conference, "The Teflon is gone. The Don is covered with Velcro, and all the charges stuck." On June 23, 1992, Glasser sentenced both defendants to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole and a $250,000 fine.